The mansion stood at the edge of a cliff, its imposing silhouette outlined against the dark sky. Dozens of luxury cars lined the driveway as elegantly dressed guests stepped out, their masks glinting in the faint moonlight. It was the New Year's Eve Masquerade, an annual event hosted by the enigmatic billionaire Elias Vanderhall. Invitations were as rare as they were coveted, promising an unforgettable night of decadence and mystery. Catherine adjusted her intricate silver mask as she walked through the grand entrance. Inside, chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light. Waiters glided past with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Everything about the scene was perfect, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Catherine couldn't shake. Her invitation had been unexpected. She wasn't wealthy, nor part of the elite social circle. Yet there it was, delivered in an ornate envelope, with her name embossed in gold. As she mingled, she noticed others glancing around nervously, their masks hiding furrowed brows. It wasn't just her. Something was off. The unease deepened when a waiter discreetly handed Catherine a folded note. It was tucked beneath her champagne flute, the handwriting precise but unfamiliar. "You are not safe. Watch your back." Her stomach tightened. She scanned the crowd, but everyone seemed absorbed in their conversations and laughter. Shaking off her nerves, she slipped the note into her clutch and made her way to the edge of the room, where the host stood greeting guests. Elias Vanderhall was magnetic, his sharp features partially obscured by a golden mask. Rumours surrounded him, whispers of failed investments, enemies made in high places, and secrets buried beneath his empire. As Catherine approached, his piercing gaze locked onto her. "Miss Grey," he said smoothly, his voice low. "Enjoying the evening?" "Yes," she lied, the note burning in her mind. "It's quite unique. Good." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you'll find it memorable." Before she could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and when the lights returned, a shrill scream cut through the music. Near the centre of the ballroom, a man lay on the floor, his mask tightened around his neck like a noose. His face was blue, his eyes wide and lifeless. Panic erupted. Guests backed away, some shouting for help. Catherine's heart raced as she watched Elias step forward, his expression unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his tone calm despite the chaos. "This is unfortunate, but I assure you everything is under control. Please remain where you are." The crowd murmured uneasily, but no one dared to leave. Security guards appeared, sealing the exits. Catherine's pulse quickened. This wasn't an accident. Another waiter approached her, slipping a second note into her hand before vanishing into the crowd. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. "You're next." She bolted for the nearest exit, but a guard blocked her path. "No one leaves," he said firmly. She retreated, her mind racing. Who had sent the notes? And why her? The lights flickered again. When they steadied, another scream rang out. This time, a woman in an emerald gown lay slumped against a column, her mask shattered beside her. A pool of blood spread beneath her, a knife protruding from her chest. The panic turned to outright chaos as guests pushed against the locked doors, shouting and pounding for release. Catherine slipped into a side hallway, desperate to escape the crowd. Her heels echoed against the marble floor as she ducked into an empty library. She sank into a chair, trying to steady her breathing. But as the silence settled, she heard faint footsteps approaching. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. A figure stepped into the doorway, their face obscured by a simple black mask. They held a champagne flute, swirling the liquid lazily. "Why are you running?" the figure asked, their voice distorted. "The party's just getting interesting." Catherine bolted to her feet, her back against the wall. "Stay away from me." The figure tilted their head. "But you were invited, Miss Grey. You must be special." "Who are you?" she demanded. The figure laughed softly, stepping closer. Catherine grabbed a heavy book from a nearby shelf and hurled it, but the figure sidestepped easily. "Do you think you were chosen by accident?" they said. Elias likes his games, but this one is special. He's cleaning house." "What are you talking about?" she whispered. The figure paused, as if considering whether to answer. "You're here because someone wants you gone. He's just the one pulling the strings." Before she could respond, the figure turned and vanished into the shadows. The doors to the library burst open as security guards rushed in, followed by Elias. "Miss Gray," he said, his voice sharp. "You shouldn't be wandering alone." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Was he the killer, or just another pawn in this twisted game? Before she could speak, he extended a hand. "Come with me. You're safe now." But as she looked into his cold eyes, she knew one thing for certain. No one in that mansion was safe. The Masquerade Ball was the highlight of the year. Hosted in a centuries-old mansion at the heart of the city, it drew the wealthy, the influential, and the curious. Anna had received her invitation unexpectedly. A gilded envelope slipped under her apartment door. She couldn't resist the intrigue. The note promised an evening of elegance, mystery, and anonymity. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, their light reflecting off the intricate masks of the guests. The sound of a live orchestra filled the air, and a sea of vibrant gowns and tailored suits moved in time to the music. Anna adjusted her emerald green mask, her heart racing as she stepped further into the room. Then she saw her, the dancer in red. Among the muted golds, silvers, and blacks of the guests, the dancer stood out. Her crimson gown shimmered like fire, and her matching mask hid everything but her piercing eyes. She moved with an almost hypnotic grace, weaving through the crowd like a predator sizing up its prey. The room seemed to part for her, every head turning to watch as she passed. Anna couldn't look away. "Who is that?" she whispered to a man standing nearby. He glanced at the dancer, his expression tightening. "I've no idea, but there's something off." Anna nodded, her unease growing. The dancer's presence was magnetic, but the way she moved, deliberate and calculated, sent a chill down her spine. The orchestra struck up a new tune, and the guests paired off for a waltz. The dancer, now at the centre of the room, began to twirl, her gown a blur of red. She didn't seem to have a partner, but no one dared approach her. The first scream shattered the music. A man collapsed near the edge of the room, clutching his throat. Blood seeped through his crisp white shirt, pooling on the polished floor. Guests screamed and scattered, the waltz forgotten. Anna stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. The man's mask lay shattered beside him, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. "Everyone stay calm," a voice called out, but the panic had already spread. The orchestra stopped playing, and guards rushed to secure the doors. No one could leave. Anna's eyes darted to the dancer in red. She stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold. Her head tilted slightly, as if amused. Then, without a word, she disappeared into the crowd. Moments later, a second scream rang out. This time, a woman collapsed near the refreshments table, her mask cracked in two. A knife jutted from her back, its silver blade gleaming. The crowd surged toward the exits, but the guards held firm, locking everyone inside. Anna felt a hand on her arm and spun around, ready to scream. It was Mark, an acquaintance she'd spotted earlier in the evening. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," he said, his eyes darting nervously. "But I think it's her, the one in red. The dancer." Mark nodded. "She's been moving through the crowd all night. Every time someone dies, she's nearby." Anna's stomach twisted. "But why?" "I don't know. But we need to stick together." The two of them began moving toward the edge of the room, keeping an eye out for the dancer. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted completely. Guests whispered in frightened tones, clutching their masks as if they could protect them. The once elegant space now felt suffocating, the opulence a cruel contrast to the bloodstains on the floor. Then Anna saw her again. The dancer in red stood at the base of the grand staircase, her head tilted as she surveyed the room. Her eyes locked with Anna's, and a cold smile spread across her lips. She lifted a gloved hand and beckoned. "No," Anna whispered, stepping back. The dancer began to ascend the staircase, her movements impossibly smooth, her gown trailing behind her like spilled wine. "Come on," Mark urged, pulling Anna toward the side door. But as they moved, the lights flickered and dimmed. In the sudden shadows, the sound of footsteps echoed unnervingly close. "Mark," Anna whispered, but he was gone. She turned frantically, her heart pounding as she searched the darkened room. Guests stumbled and shouted, their masks glowing faintly in the dim light. The dancer in red was nowhere to be seen. A hand clamped down on Anna's shoulder. She screamed and spun around, her fist connecting with a solid chest. "Anna, it's me!" Mark hissed, holding up his hands. "Come on, we have to—" His voice cut off as a thin line appeared across his throat. Blood poured out as he collapsed to the ground, his mask falling away. Behind him stood the dancer, her knife glinting in the low light. Anna stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The dancer tilted her head again, as if savouring the moment, before stepping forward. Anna turned and ran, her heels slipping on the blood-slick floor. She burst through a side door and into the servants' corridor, the muffled sounds of panic fading behind her. She didn't stop running until she reached the outer gardens, her chest heaving. The night was cold and silent, the ballroom a distant glow behind her. For a moment, she thought she was safe. Then she heard the rustle of fabric behind her. Turning slowly, she saw the dancer in red standing beneath an archway, her knife dripping with blood. Her mask glinted in the moonlight, and her voice was barely audible as she spoke. "This dance isn't over." The corporate retreat was supposed to be a night of bonding, luxury, and trust-building exercises. At least, that's what the CEO, Richard Weller, had promised his executives. The event was held at an opulent private estate, hidden deep in the countryside. The invitation was clear: arrive promptly at 6 p.m, wear a mask of your choosing, and be prepared for an unforgettable evening. Tensions had been brewing at the company for months. Rumours of backdoor deals, cutthroat betrayals, and embezzlement had soured relationships. But tonight, behind the anonymity of masks, the group was meant to start fresh. The ballroom glimmered with golden light as the executives entered, their masks adding an air of mystery. The theme was decadence, and the tables overflowed with fine wines, exquisite food, and a promise of indulgence. As the employees mingled, laughter mixed with murmurs of unease. No one could entirely shake the tension that had followed them from the boardroom. Richard raised his glass from the head of the long dining table, his silver wolf mask catching the light. "Tonight is about unity," he said, his voice commanding. "We've had our differences, but here in this place, we leave them behind. Enjoy yourselves." As dinner began, the guests relaxed, their laughter growing louder. The wine flowed freely, and the masks gave everyone a sense of freedom. But it wasn't long before the first note was discovered. Tucked beneath a wineglass, the folded paper was addressed to a senior executive, Margaret, who had spent the evening avoiding eye contact with her peers. She read it silently, her face draining of colour. The message was simple. "I know what you did." Margaret excused herself from the table, retreating to the powder room. When she didn't return after several minutes, her assistant went to check on her. Moments later, a scream echoed through the mansion. The group rushed to the scene. Margaret's body was slumped against the marble sink, her mask shattered on the floor. Her throat was slashed, her blood pooling around her. On the mirror, written in red lipstick, were the words, "One down." Panic spread like wildfire. "This has to be a joke," someone muttered, though the terror in their voice betrayed them. Richard's booming voice cut through the chaos. "No one leaves. Security has locked the doors, and we'll get to the bottom of this." His command didn't calm the group. Whispers spread as accusations flew. Margaret had been skimming from the company, one man said. Everyone knew. "Who's next?" someone else hissed, their eyes darting nervously. The second note was found soon after, tucked into the pocket of Michael, the CFO. The words made his heart pound. "You'll pay for your betrayal." He clenched his fists, trying to appear calm, but it was clear the message had rattled him. He left the room quietly, his mask slipping slightly as he glanced over his shoulder. Not long after, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the hall. The group rushed toward the sound, finding Michael hanging from the balcony railing. His mask was missing, and his lifeless body swayed gently, the words, "Greed kills," scrawled on a note pinned to his chest. Richard's mask couldn't hide the rage in his eyes. "Whoever's doing this, stop hiding! Show yourself!" His voice reverberated through the room, but no answer came. Anna, a junior executive, tugged on Richard's arm. "We need to leave. This isn't about unity, it's revenge." Richard glared at her. "You don't know what you're talking about." But she did. The retreat wasn't just about bonding, it was damage control. Richard had invited his most trusted and most threatening employees, the ones who knew his secrets, the ones who could destroy him. Someone in the room was using the anonymity of the masks to settle scores. Another note appeared, this time addressed to Anna. It read, "You've been loyal, but loyalty won't save you." Her hands shook as she showed it to Richard. "We're all targets," she whispered. "Even you." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Shouts erupted, followed by a crash and the sound of glass shattering. When the lights returned, another body lay in the centre of the room. Timothy, one of Richard's longest-serving allies. His mask was gone, his face frozen in an expression of terror. A knife protruded from his chest, and the note beside him read, "Silence is deadly." The remaining guests huddled together, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting to every shadow. Richard's composure cracked. "We're leaving," he barked. But when they reached the main doors, they found them locked, the keys missing. From the balcony above, a figure emerged, cloaked in black with a simple, featureless mask. They spoke in a calm, measured tone. "The sins of this company run deep. Tonight we clean house." Richard charged forward, but the figure disappeared into the darkness. One by one, the lights began to go out again, the darkness consuming the room. Anna's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wall, clutching her mask as if it could protect her. A scream pierced the air, followed by silence. When the lights returned, only Anna and Richard remained. The masked figure stood between them, holding a knife dripping with blood. They tilted their head, their voice echoing through the hall. "Who deserves to live?" The wedding of Elizabeth and Charles was the social event of the year. Hosted in a secluded countryside estate, the couple spared no expense to ensure their celebration was a night to remember. The invitation explicitly required guests to wear elegant masks for the evening reception, adding an air of mystery to the festivities. Elizabeth loved the idea. It felt timeless, romantic. But as the night wore on, the masks would become symbols of something much darker. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden chandeliers illuminated rows of tables adorned with fine china and cascading floral arrangements. Guests in extravagant gowns and tailored suits danced beneath the glittering lights. The bride, dressed in white with a delicate lace mask, looked radiant. Charles, her dashing groom, watched her adoringly. As the clock struck midnight, the staff discreetly locked the estate doors. A storm had begun outside, heavy rain battering the windows, making it impossible for anyone to leave. The estate's remote location meant no one questioned the precaution. It seemed sensible to keep the guests safe from the storm. The first sign of trouble came when a server found a blood-stained mask abandoned on the floor. He quickly brought it to the wedding planner, who brushed it off as a prank. But Elizabeth overheard and couldn't shake her unease. Moments later, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by nervous laughter. When the lights returned, the laughter died. At the edge of the dance floor, a man lay on the ground, his body twisted unnaturally. His mask was gone, and his face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the polished wood. Screams erupted as guests scrambled away. Charles ran to the man's side, but it was too late. The storm outside roared louder, the rain hammering against the windows. "Everyone stay calm," Charles shouted, trying to restore order. "It could be an accident." But it wasn't. Minutes later, another guest screamed. A woman was found slumped in her chair, a jagged wound across her throat. Her mask was missing, her face obscured by her long hair. Panic spread like wildfire. Guests pressed against the locked doors, pounding and shouting to be let out, but the staff had vanished. Elizabeth clung to Charles. "What is happening?" she whispered. Charles shook his head, his jaw tight. "We'll get through this." Another cry came from the centre of the room. A note was found tucked under a glass at one of the tables. It read, "Only the worthy deserve to leave." The ballroom descended into chaos. Some guests turned on each other, accusing one another of being the killer. Others huddled in corners, trembling behind their masks. Elizabeth scanned the room, her heart racing. Her wedding, the happiest night of her life, had become a nightmare. A waiter's tray clattered to the ground, drawing everyone's attention. Another body lay sprawled beneath the table, a shattered mask beside them. Carved into the wood above the body were the words, "Another unworthy soul." The killer was in the room, hidden among them, and no one knew who to trust. Charles rallied a small group to search for a way out. They pried open a side door, only to find a long hallway that led to the servants' quarters. The group hesitated, but Charles pressed forward, Elizabeth close behind. The hallway was eerily silent, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the walls. "Stay close," Charles whispered. At the end of the hall, they found a small control panel with switches labelled for the estate's systems. Charles reached to unlock the doors, but as his hand moved toward the lever, a knife plunged through his chest. He gasped, blood staining his pristine white suit, and collapsed to the floor. Elizabeth screamed, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. Behind her, a masked figure stepped out of the shadows, holding the bloody knife. Their mask was featureless, smooth and reflective, obscuring any hint of identity. "You ruined it," the figure said in a low voice, tilting their head. This was supposed to be perfect. Elizabeth backed away, trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The figure's head tilted again, as if considering the question. "You wouldn't understand. Not yet." Before Elizabeth could respond, the figure disappeared into the darkness. She stumbled back into the ballroom, tears streaming down her face. The remaining guests were huddled together, their whispers frantic. Another body lay on the floor, the killer's mark etched into the victim's mask. Elizabeth realised there was no escape. The storm raged outside, the doors were locked, and the killer moved among them, blending perfectly with the masked crowd. As the night dragged on, the guests dwindled. One by one they were picked off, each body found with their mask missing, replaced by a cryptic message carved into the floor. Elizabeth clutched her torn dress, her mind racing. When dawn finally broke, the storm subsided. The main doors creaked open, sunlight spilling into the devastated ballroom. Elizabeth was the only one left, her dress stained with blood, her mask askew. She stumbled into the daylight, gasping for air. Behind her, the estate loomed in silence. But as she turned back, she saw them, dozens of masks lined up neatly on the steps, each one staring back at her. And at the top of the steps stood the figure, their featureless mask glinting in the morning light. The invitation had been clear. You are cordially invited to an exclusive murder mystery masquerade. Trust no one, solve the game, and win the prize of a lifetime. It came with an ornate mask and instructions to arrive promptly at 7 p.m. The location, an isolated manor on a misty hilltop, added to the allure. 15 guests gathered in the grand hall, their faces obscured by elaborate masks. The room was draped in dark velvet, illuminated only by flickering candelabras. The host, a man in a plain black mask and a tailored suit, stepped forward to address the group. "Welcome to the game," he said in a deep, measured tone. "Tonight, one of you is the killer. Your job is to unmask them before it's too late. Remember, in this game, secrets are your weapon, and trust is your enemy." The room buzzed with excitement as the rules were explained. Clues would be hidden throughout the manor, and the guests could interrogate one another to uncover the killer's identity. But when the host added, "The consequences for failure are dire," an uneasy laugh rippled through the crowd. As the game began, the guests fanned out, searching for clues. Some rifled through bookshelves in the library, others crept through darkened hallways, and a few lingered in the dining room, sipping wine and speculating about the game's twists. The first scream came an hour later. The guests rushed to the parlour, where a man lay sprawled on the floor, a knife protruding from his chest. His mask, a golden lion, was missing. The host appeared suddenly, his dark figure looming over the scene. "It seems the game has truly begun," he said calmly. "Wait," a woman in a feathered mask stammered. "Is this real?" The host tilted his head. "What do you think?" The room erupted into chaos. "This wasn't part of the plan," one man shouted. "We need to leave." But the host gestured to the doors. "You're free to try," he said. The guests scrambled to the entrance, only to find it locked. The windows, too, were barred, and the thick mist outside seemed impenetrable. "What the hell is going on?" someone demanded. The host smiled beneath his mask. "The rules are simple. Solve the mystery, or don't." With no choice but to continue, the group reluctantly returned to the game. Tensions ran high as alliances formed and dissolved. Whispers filled the air as suspicions grew. Some guests accused one another outright, while others feigned ignorance. Then came the second death. A woman in a sapphire mask was found in the study. Her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Another mask had disappeared. Pinned to her dress was a note. "Lies are deadly." The host's voice echoed through the manor. "The killer is among you. Who do you trust?" Panic spread. A man in a fox mask grabbed a candlestick, his hands trembling. "I'm not waiting to be next," he growled, his eyes darting to the others. "Stay away from me." The guests began to fracture, each person retreating into their own corner of the manor. Anna, a quiet woman in a simple silver mask, stayed close to the shadows. She had been watching, listening, piecing together the connections between the victims. The Golden Lion had been an investment banker known for ruthless deals. The sapphire mask belonged to a woman infamous for corporate espionage. Both had enemies, lots of them. The killer wasn't choosing at random. Hours passed, and the deaths continued. Each body was found with their mask missing and a cryptic message left behind. The notes became increasingly personal, referencing sins and betrayals the victims had tried to keep hidden. Anna's heart raced as she realized the killer was using the game to expose secrets. Her own invitation flashed through her mind. She had come out of curiosity, but what if her presence wasn't a coincidence? What if she had been chosen for a reason? The remaining guests gathered in the grand hall, their masks askew and their nerves frayed. Only 5 of them were left. The host appeared once more, his calm demeanour unshaken. "It's time to make your accusations," he said. "Who is the killer?" The group exchanged frantic glances. "It's him," a man shouted, pointing at the host. "This whole thing was his idea." The host chuckled. "How predictable. Do you think the killer would make it so obvious?" Anna stepped forward. "It's none of us," she said, her voice steady. "This game isn't about finding the killer. It's about surviving." The others stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" one asked. "The killer doesn't care about being caught," Anna continued. "They're punishing us. This game is their way of making us suffer for our secrets." A slow clap echoed through the room. The host removed his mask, revealing a face none of them recognized. His eyes glinted with amusement. "Well done," he said. "You've figured it out." "Who are you?" Anna demanded. "Someone who knows the truth about each of you," he replied. "This game was never about winning. It was about justice." Before anyone could react, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, screams and footsteps echoing through the hall. When the lights returned, the host was gone. Anna stood in the centre of the room, surrounded by empty masks. The others had vanished, leaving her alone in the grand hall. A single note lay at her feet. "You were the only innocent one." The doors creaked open, revealing the misty dawn outside. Anna stumbled into the cool air, her mind racing. The manor loomed behind her, silent and still. The game was over, but the memories and the secrets would haunt her forever. Anton was no stranger to the eerie silence of Pripyat. As a seasoned stalker, he had braved countless forays into the exclusion zone, scavenging for artifacts to sell to collectors obsessed with Chernobyl's grim history. But this time was different. His destination was the hospital, a place he had always avoided. The hospital loomed before him, its facade crumbling but still menacing. The shattered windows gaped like blackened eyes, and the air around the building felt heavier. Rumours had always swirled about the horrors inside, the rushed evacuations, the contaminated workers left behind, and the unexplained disappearances of those who dared to enter. But Anton couldn't resist the lure of potential treasure. He pushed open the rusted doors, his Geiger counter clicking softly as he stepped inside. The lobby was a wasteland of overturned chairs, broken glass, and decaying medical equipment. The air was stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood and chemicals. Anton adjusted his mask and flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. He began his search methodically, moving from one room to the next. Most of what he found was useless: shattered vials, mouldy documents, and rusted tools. Then, in a back office, he stumbled upon a blood-stained ledger tucked inside a drawer. Its cover was embossed with the hospital's insignia, and inside were neatly written patient records. The entries were mundane at first: names, injuries, treatments. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The final entries, dated just days before the reactor explosion, mentioned patients admitted with severe radiation burns. One name caught his eye: unidentified worker number 14. The notes were sparse, but one line sent a chill down his spine. Transferred to basement ward 6. Do not open, per doctor. Volkov Anton's brow furrowed. The basement wasn't marked on the maps he'd studied. Intrigued, he left the office and began searching for an access point. After nearly an hour of combing the building, he found a door partially concealed behind a toppled filing cabinet. It was heavy, rusted, and adorned with faded biohazard warnings. His Geiger counter ticked faster as he pried it open. The basement was colder, the walls slick with condensation. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed through the narrow corridors. The air felt thicker, oppressive. Anton's flashlight flickered as he followed the faint remnants of signage toward Ward 6. He found it at the end of a long hallway. The door was sealed with chains, a warning scrawled in red paint: "Do not enter." Anton hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But greed and curiosity pushed him forward. He used his bolt cutters to snap the chains, the sound reverberating ominously. The door groaned open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. His flashlight revealed rows of hospital beds, each occupied. At first he thought the figures were corpses, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were something worse. The patients were alive, or something close to it. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched taut over warped bones. Their eyes were sunken, their mouths slightly agape. Some had 4 lines still attached, leading to rusted stands with empty bags. Anton's Geiger counter screamed, the radiation levels spiking dangerously. He stumbled back, his heart racing. Then, one of the figures moved. Its head turned slowly, milky eyes locking onto him. A guttural moan escaped its lips, a sound filled with agony and something else: rage. Another figure stirred, then another. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though their bodies were fighting against the decay that had consumed them. Anton backed toward the door, but his foot caught on a fallen IV stand. The clang echoed through the room, and the patients began to rise. Their moans grew louder, the sound reverberating through the ward. Panicking, Anton bolted, slamming the door behind him. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in as he sprinted toward the stairs. Behind him, he heard the scraping of feet, the moans growing closer. He reached the main floor, gasping for air. His Geiger counter was still ticking wildly as he burst into the open air. He didn't stop running until he was miles from the hospital, collapsing against the side of an abandoned building. Days later, he returned to the safety of the stalker camp. He tried to tell the others about what he had seen, but they dismissed him as paranoid. Radiation exposure, they said, could cause hallucinations. But Anton knew the truth. The patients were still there, trapped in that cursed hospital. Whatever experiments the doctors had performed had twisted them into something inhuman. And now, the thought haunted him. What if they weren't trapped at all? What if they were waiting for someone to open that door again? Victor's evenings were quiet. His small apartment hummed with the soft static of his radio equipment, where he scanned the airwaves for faint, forgotten signals. One cold winter night, his receiver caught something strange. Amid the crackle of static came numbers, spoken in a monotone voice, followed by a low hum, mechanical and eerie. Adjusting the frequency, he caught the end of the transmission, a distorted whisper saying, "Chernobyl." His hands trembled as he jotted down the numbers, coordinates. They pointed to Reactor 4, ground zero of the 1986 disaster. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. Packing his gear and a Geiger counter, Victor headed for the exclusion zone. At the perimeter fence, the frozen air was unnaturally still. A contact had granted him access, warning him to avoid Reactor 4. Yet as he walked through the desolate landscape of Pripyat, the signal in his earpiece grew stronger. His Geiger counter clicked steadily, the radiation levels rising. Ignoring the danger, Victor entered the reactor through a rusted service door. Inside, the air was stifling, laced with decay. He followed the hum down crumbling hallways, reaching a control room. Amid the dust and debris, a tape recorder sat on a desk, its reels spinning. The same signal he'd heard earlier emanated from it. As he reached for the machine, a loud clatter echoed from the hallway. He froze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. He spun around, flashlight cutting through the shadows. A figure stumbled into view, hunched and misshapen. Its blistered, translucent skin clung to twisted bones, and its milky eyes tracked Victor's every move. "Help!" the man rasped, his voice brittle. "Stop! The signal!" Victor backed away, tripping over a chair as the man collapsed, convulsing violently. Moments later, he was still. The Geiger counter screamed as the hum from the tape recorder grew louder. Victor shut it off, but the sound didn't stop. It vibrated through the walls, shaking the floor. Searching the control panel, Victor found a compartment stuffed with faded documents. Flipping through the brittle pages, he pieced together a horrifying truth. Decades earlier, Soviet scientists had created a device to suppress radiation, called the emitter. Instead of neutralizing radiation, the low-frequency signal mutated organic tissue, twisting victims into grotesque forms. The project had been buried after the reactor explosion, but the emitter remained active. The hum intensified, resonating in Victor's chest. He bolted from the room, the twisted corridors disorienting him. The Geiger counter's frantic clicks urged him forward until he finally emerged into the frigid air outside. But even there, the hum persisted, faint but unmistakable. Back in his apartment days later, Victor destroyed his radio equipment, desperate to escape the signal. Yet one night, as he lay in bed, the hum returned. It vibrated through the walls, accompanied by distorted whispers. His skin itched and blistered, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw his reflection twist, his body warping into the very nightmare he had uncovered. The signal had found him. The auditorium loomed in the heart of Pripyat, its crumbling facade an eerie relic of the city's forgotten life. Dr. Elena Markova and her team of researchers approached cautiously, their Geiger counters ticking softly. They hadn't planned to visit the building, but curiosity had led them here. The doors groaned as Pavel, Elena's assistant, pushed them open. Inside, rows of decayed seats stretched toward a stage framed by tattered curtains. The air was thick, carrying a faint metallic tang. "Let's make this quick," Pavel said, his voice echoing off the walls. Eleanor ignored him, stepping toward the stage. Props and equipment lay scattered across it, remnants of a long-abandoned performance. She bent to examine a crumbling script, the faded text barely legible. Then they heard it. Faint singing. The melody drifted through the space, soft and childlike. The team froze, flashlight sweeping the empty room. "Is it a recording?" one of the technicians asked nervously. "There's no power here," Pavel muttered, his grip tightening on his equipment. The singing grew clearer, seeming to come from everywhere. Elena motioned toward a side door leading backstage. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The narrow hallway beyond was lined with peeling posters and broken furniture. At its centre was a dusty reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels spinning despite the building's long-dead power supply. Pavel hesitated before reaching for the machine. As his fingers brushed the switch, the singing stopped. Silence pressed down on them like a weight. Then came the whispers. They echoed from the auditorium, low and fragmented. Eleanor turned back, her flashlight revealing shapes moving in the shadows, childlike silhouettes standing among the seats. Motionless at first, they began to step forward, their movements slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" Eleanor called out, her voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. They moved unnaturally, like shadows cast by an unseen flame. "Let's leave," Pavel whispered, grabbing her arm. But as they turned, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit disappearing into darkness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unintelligible cacophony. One of the technicians panicked and bolted. His flashlight flickered as he ran, the beam fading into the void. When it returned, he was gone. The team's breaths came in ragged gasps as the remaining three stumbled back toward the stage, hoping for another exit. The air grew heavier, the temperature rising unnaturally. The silhouettes multiplied, emerging from walls and floors, their hands outstretched. Elena's flashlight caught glimpses of their faces, blistered skin, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. They moved jerkily as if controlled by invisible strings. "Run!" Elena shouted. Pavel tripped and fell behind her, his scream cut short as the shadows enveloped him. She didn't look back. She and the last technician burst through a side door, collapsing into the cold night air. The city was silent, save for the faint ticking of their Geiger counters. Neither spoke as they stumbled back to their vehicle, shaken and gasping. Days later, Elena reviewed the recordings from their equipment. Most of the footage was corrupted, the audio distorted into faint static. But one frame froze her blood. A shot of the auditorium as they fled. The rows of seats were filled with silhouettes, their faces turned toward the camera. She deleted the file. Elena never returned to the zone, but the singing haunted her dreams. On quiet nights, she swore she could still hear it, a faint childlike choir calling her back. The Chernobyl exclusion zone was vast, eerie and silent. For the group of stalkers, Anton, Oleg, Dima and Irina, it was also irresistible. Stories of strange sights, abandoned relics, and the lingering mystery of Soviet experiments made the zone their ultimate target. They knew the risks, from radiation to territorial guards, but they had done their research. They were prepared, or so they thought. On the third day of their expedition, deep in the woods, they stumbled upon an abandoned village. The houses were skeletal, their wooden frames rotting and sagging. The wind howled through broken windows, carrying a faint metallic tang. In the largest house, they found a trapdoor leading to a hidden bunker. Excitement replaced caution as they descended into the darkness, their flashlights illuminating rusted shelves filled with Soviet-era relics. Among the artifacts was a sealed metal box. Inside were stacks of undeveloped film canisters, their labels written in faded Cyrillic. "Military experiment records," Irina read aloud, her voice tinged with excitement. They decided to take the canisters with them, planning to develop the film back at their makeshift camp. By nightfall, they had set up near the ruins of an old school, the forest pressing close. Anton rigged a portable projector to display the developed film on a crumbling wall. As the reels began to play, the group fell silent. The footage was grainy and erratic, showing soldiers in gas masks leading what appeared to be test subjects, ordinary people, into darkened rooms. The next reel was more disturbing. Distorted humanoid figures standing in shadows, their faces blurred or entirely absent. In several frames, the shadows seemed to move independently, creeping closer to the camera. "This is insane," Oleg muttered, shifting uncomfortably. What were they doing here? Irina rewound the reel, pausing on a frame that showed a soldier pointing at a shadowy figure. "It's not just experiments," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like they were hunting something." The last reel was different. It wasn't filmed in a lab but outside, in a forest, strikingly similar to the one they were in now. The camera panned over a group of men, tense and armed. In the background, shadows moved unnaturally, too fast for any living creature. The footage ended abruptly as the camera fell to the ground, capturing only blurred movements and muffled screams. "Turn it off," Dima said, his voice sharp. "This isn't worth it." Anton hesitated, then powered down the projector. The group sat in uneasy silence, the distant rustling of leaves suddenly deafening. "It's just film," Anton said, trying to sound confident. "Probably staged, Soviet propaganda." But none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, Irina woke to a faint rustling outside the tent. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound was steady, deliberate, like footsteps circling the camp. She nudged Anton awake. "There's something out there." Anton grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, just enough to peer out. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. "Probably an animal," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The next morning, they found strange marks on the ground, elongated impressions, almost like clawed feet, leading toward the forest. Oleg laughed nervously. "Wild boars, maybe?" No one responded. That evening, as dusk fell, they decided to move camp closer to the village for safety. The forest grew darker, the air thicker. They set up quickly, each person keeping their weapons close. The unease grew as shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching unnaturally toward the campfire. Then the whispers began. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the voices were unmistakable, low and guttural. Anton shone his flashlight into the woods, the beam catching a fleeting figure, a shadow darting between trees, too fast to be human. "We're not alone," he said, his voice shaking. The whispers grew louder, closer. Shadows began to emerge from the darkness, humanoid yet featureless, their movements erratic and disjointed. Irina fired her rifle, the gunshot shattering the night. One of the figures dissolved into the ground like smoke, but more took its place. "Run!" Anton shouted. The group scattered, each person sprinting into the woods. Irina's flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of twisted, moving shapes. She tripped over a root, falling hard. When she looked up, one of the figures loomed over her. Its face, or lack thereof, was a void, pulling her into its suffocating darkness. Anton and Oleg regrouped near an old barn, panting and clutching their weapons. "Where's Irina? Dima?" Oleg asked, his voice breaking. Anton shook his head, too terrified to speak. The whispers surrounded them, closing in. By morning, the camp was silent. The only sign of the group was the projector, left running in the village. It displayed the final reel of film, looping endlessly. A soldier pointing at a shadowy figure, the darkness creeping closer. Yuri was no stranger to the exclusion zone. For years, he had scavenged the abandoned ruins of Pripyat, navigating its irradiated alleys and crumbling buildings for items of value. It was a dangerous life, but the thrill of discovery and the hefty payouts made it worth it. Besides, he had no family, no ties to the world outside the zone. Here, he felt strangely at home. That night, Yuri camped in the shadow of a decrepit apartment block. The air was eerily still, the only sounds the occasional creak of rusted metal and the distant howl of wind through the empty streets. He sat by a dim lantern, flipping through a notebook of hastily drawn maps, marking areas to explore the next day. Then he heard it. Faint but distinct. The shrill metallic ring of a payphone. He froze, ears straining to confirm what he thought he'd heard. The sound came again, echoing through the silent city. His brow furrowed. Payphones hadn't worked in Pripyat for decades, their wires long corroded or scavenged. He grabbed his flashlight, strapped on his mask, and set off toward the sound. The ringing led him to Lenin Square, where a single payphone stood in the shadow of a crumbling building. The phone, its once bright yellow paint now faded and peeling, sat unnervingly intact. The receiver dangled from its cord, swinging gently as if recently touched. The ringing stopped as Yuri approached, the silence louder than any noise. Slowly he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he asked, his voice muffled through his mask. At first there was only static. Then a voice crackled through, distorted but unmistakably human. "Yuri," it whispered, his name stretching unnaturally long. "You shouldn't have come back." His breath hitched. "Who is this?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the receiver. "Do you remember the tunnels?" the voice rasped. "We're still here." The line went dead. Yuri stood frozen, heart pounding. The tunnels. Memories he had tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. His first expedition to the zone years ago, when he and a group of rookies had discovered a network of underground passages beneath Pripyat. Only he had made it out alive. The others. He had never spoken of what happened to the others. The phone began ringing again, louder this time. He dropped the receiver and backed away, but the sound followed him, echoing through the square. He turned and ran, the ringing chasing him down the darkened streets. He didn't stop until he was back at his camp. Slamming the door of the apartment block behind him, he leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. He pulled out his Geiger counter and scanned the area. Normal levels, nothing unusual. But when he turned to his maps, he found one marked with an X he hadn't drawn. It pointed to the maintenance entrance of the tunnels. "No," he muttered to himself, "I'm not going back." But he couldn't shake the feeling that the phone's call wasn't over. As the hours dragged on, a faint hum filled the air, growing louder with every passing minute. He covered his ears, but the sound vibrated in his chest, drawing him to the tunnels as if pulled by invisible strings. At dawn, Yuri stood at the rusted hatch leading underground. His flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness as he descended the ladder. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint stench of decay. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls. Deeper he went, following a trail of strange markings on the floor, scratches that looked almost deliberate. Finally, he reached a cavernous chamber filled with ancient machinery. At its centre stood a tangle of cables and wires, pulsating faintly, as though alive. The hum stopped. In the sudden silence, Yuri felt the hairs on his neck rise. From the shadows, something moved. A figure stepped forward, its silhouette human yet wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched, its limbs unnaturally elongated, as if warped by years of radiation. Its eyes were milky white, but they locked onto Yuri with unsettling precision. "We waited," it said, its voice the same as the one on the phone. Yuri stumbled back. "What are you?" "We were left here," it rasped. "Forgotten. But we adapted." The cables behind the creature shifted, slithering like snakes. The realization hit Yuri like a punch. The figure wasn't alone. Others emerged from the darkness, their bodies fused with the wires, their movements jerky but purposeful. Yuri turned and ran, his flashlight flickering wildly. He could hear them behind him, their voices blending with the hum that now filled the tunnels. "You can't leave," they whispered. "You're part of us now." He scrambled up the ladder and slammed the hatch shut. The hum stopped, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. But as he stumbled into the daylight, he heard it again, the shrill ring of a payphone, louder than before. And this time, it was coming from his camp.